So here we are attending this session online with internet, a media where a picture of a cat can go viral in a blink of an eye. And we are here attending this conference online because a virus from the other side of the planet end up shaking up all our world. We live in a world that is connected and complex, but today we are here to discuss more positive aspects of complexity, and specifically practical application of complexity in software and digital product development. This is interesting for all team members, for technical coaches, or any type of facilitator, but I will suggest that the topic that we are discussing today are interesting and important also for managers and leaders. This is the book that this presentation is based on, and my name is Luca Minudel. My journey in complexity started around 2004 when Joseph PELRINE introduced the concept of complexity to explain why Agile works. In the same way that mathematicians at some point tried to study the foundation of mathematics, in Agile software development, we started to study the foundation of why Agile works. And since then, I started to learn about, and I was fascinated from complexity science. And I started to apply those learnings in small teams. First, in Ferrari, where I work in Formula One. There, the organization was quite flat, and there was a lot of social interactions because all the work of every department come together in the car. And also later on in Stockholm, in London, and in ThoughtWorks, I start to apply complexity. I have explored the work of many different authors and many different models, some hard to find. And as long as I was finding new practical application, I was taking note of those practical applications until I realized I have list long enough to create a catalog of practical application of complexity. The work that I'm presenting today is based on the work of Joseph PELRINE, Dave Snowden, Dr. David Albers, Ralph Stacey, and many others. And there is also a couple of practices from Dean Lachana and Liz Kelb. After creating this list of practices that I'm going to introduce you today, I realized that there were two really important qualities, two new radical ideas coming out from those practices. The first is the idea that we are interested in complex systems that are human, and human as agents of a complex system have some unique quality. When I started into complexity, since my background is in software development, so technical and mathematical, I start to read about Boyd's simulation based on flocks, and it's similar for swarms of insects, and cellular automata. So those are simulation of complex models that are biological, organic, and algorithmic. While those simulations are interesting in terms of learning the theory, so they were useful to me, they can also lead in the wrong direction if you try to apply those models to human systems. One of the common misunderstandings of trying to apply this model to human system is the idea that with a small number of simple rules, you can obtain the emergence of the desired behavior in a team or in an organization. That is a common misunderstanding on applying non-human complex system theory to human complex system. The other idea is that the illusion that you can run many simulations in a computer so that you can identify the starting condition and then apply those conditions to human being in order to obtain exactly the outcome that you want. But all the complex systems are non-deterministic, and the relation between cause and effect is not always clear or non-existent. So let's look at what are the unique elements of the human agents. These come from the theory of social complexity and anthro-complexity. So anthropology applied to complexity. The three unique characteristics are identity. Each one of us is unique and different from every other. We also have intentionality. We are driven by more than instinct, pain, pleasure, needs, desire. Instead, we are driven by belief, values, principles, sentiments, emotion, intuition, sometimes even irrationality, and much more. And when you take into account this, the way that you look at the organization, the way that you think about how organization work completely change. The third element is intelligence. Yes, we have the ability to learn, but even more, we have the ability to socially co-create a new knowledge and share knowledge with others. In this time where artificial intelligence is becoming more and more important, it is also becoming more and more important to understand what are the unique elements of being human. So the first dynamic of human complex system that is interesting is human self-organization. Human self-organization is a spontaneous, ongoing process. It's happening always just because we are social in nature. So every time that we are interacting, that we are having local interaction and conversation, for example, when two co-workers are debating a problem and a solution. And so we have all this local interaction in the workplace that comes together. And then when we look at the population, the whole team, the whole department or the organization, we may start to see some regularity emerging, some patterns. For example, we can see a growing tension during a company merger. So there is something interesting about these population-wide patterns that we can observe. Again, we cannot take apart those dynamics, study each pieces of those patterns, and then bring them together in order to try to achieve the outcome that we want, as we could do with the clock, for example. Now, those population-wide patterns are more likely to a cloud that is dynamic, constantly evolving, and we cannot dissect the cloud in order to understand how it works and in order to make it work as we would like. Instead, we can only study and understand the cloud as a whole. Think for a moment about the forest. A forest is one possible example of a self-organizing system. And the weather here today is not great, but let's imagine that it is a beautiful sunny morning and you are taking a ride with your mountain bike across the forest. In the middle of your journey, you stop inside the forest, you sit down and rest, completely silent. You enjoyed the sound of the wind, the trees, leaf shaking, maybe some animal. You re-energize, jump on your bike and complete your tour. Just the next morning in that forest, there could be wildfire everywhere. So think about this self-organizing system. Left unattended can go either way, can create a beautiful morning or a complete disaster. This is important for organization because, as you understand, this organization may want to try to orient self-organization toward outcomes that are desirable and beneficial for the team, the department, and the organization. And so now I'm introducing to you the first practice that is called Basic Model from Joseph PELRINE. This practice is useful when a team is starting from scratch or when you are rebooting a team. The first part of the basic model introduced the prerequisite for self-organization so that a company can allow or support self-organization instead of hindering it. The first prerequisite is critical mass. You need at least 3 people in a team in order to allow self-organization, in order to have enough local interaction that can create population-wide patterns. The second is diversity and dissent. You need that to avoid groupthink and blind spots. And then an environment intended as a physical environment, intended as a virtual environment, intended as time and space. That environment needs to be big enough to leave room for maneuver to the team, but it also needs to be not too big. Otherwise, team members can avoid each other. If you think, for example, a baseball team, in a baseball team, that's a team, but everyone plays alone. So team members can avoid each other. But if you think about instead a tennis double or a jazz band, every member of the team chip in to help each other dynamically. And this is where they self-organize. And last, letting people do it. Let people and team members bring the decision, the dynamic that happen in that process of self-organization also into the work. The second part of this practice is the introduction of dials or control knobs. Joseph introduced those dials that have the potential to influence the dynamic of the team, and so have the potential to influence self-organization, and we can use those to do exactly what we were discussing before. Try to orient self-organization toward outcomes that are beneficial. Team size. When you reduce the team size, you increase openness of the team toward the new ideas. It's easy to reach consensus on experimenting new ideas and on keeping that idea forward. Boundaries, that means who is inside the team and who is outside. Deciding that have also a huge impact on the team dynamic. And then roles. When you assign a role to someone, you also assign an identity. And a new identity, activating an identity, also bring new behaviors. Think about extreme programming, how completely changes the roles inside the team, or Scrum, how it changes the role of a project manager. So let me give you some tip about using those control knobs. First of all, don't be like a sorcerer apprentice. Don't try to run one experiment after the other and just changing and switching all those control knobs, because the team is a system that has memory, disposition, and propensity. After every experiment, those will change. So the first suggestion to you, to the facilitator, and to the team manager is to start observing the forces at work and develop what is called situational awareness of what's going on in the self-organizing system. The second suggestion is, when you choose which control knob you want to try to change, when you enact that change and when you observe the experiment, bring with you the whole team, everyone that is involved and affected by the experiment. In that way, the change in disposition and propensity will be more positive if you bring them with you in the whole process. The third and last tip is important, is being aware that it's not possible to design an intervention on one of those control knobs, knowing in advance the outcome that you will achieve. It is a trial and error. That is the approach, because a complex system is non-deterministic. So there is something more that I would like to tell you about complex systems, that it's important, and this is what we learn when from complexity when we look at human complex system, that in a team, in a department, and in an organization, there is no privileged vantage point, not even for the senior leader and the senior leadership. There is no objective point of view and no complete view and understanding of the whole system. Everyone, every individual has a partial view of what's going on and has a limited understanding. So when you are going to take a decision at the team level or at organization level, it's important to bring the whole team and everyone involved and affected into the conversation. Every one of us in a complex system is a human sensor. And if we bring together all our partial point of view, we create a view that is much better. So I finished to describe one practice, and let me quickly recap what's happened. First, I told you about self-organization. I gave you all the information that was needed in order to continue into the practice. Then I described the purpose of this practice in order to reboot the team or start a new team and ensure the prerequisite and to direct the self-organization. I told you about the relation to complexity. I described the steps and the workflow of applying this practice, and I gave you some tips. So this is a template, a standard template that can be used to describe any complexity-related practice. In the catalog, there are overall 5 practices related to complexity that you can use to orient complexity, orient self-organization toward positive outcome. And those 5 practices introduces overall 21 knobs. The practices are listed from the smaller to the bigger. And this is important because the first practice is smaller, and it is easier to introduce that practice to your team, to start to introduce the basic vocabulary, to start to introduce the basic concept, and introduce the idea of complexity from a practical point of view. Here you got a picture with all the 21 knobs, control knobs introduced by these 5 practices, and the description of every single control knobs. When I look at the catalog and the list of the practices in the book that I collected, that I wrote, I realized that there was a second powerful idea looking at those practices. And this is the idea of shifting the conversation around complexity from theory into practice. When you look at many of the books around the topic of complexity science, you will soon realize that many of those books are very theoretical. And also people that is passionate about complexity science and complexity thinking, as much as I am, tend to talk about that in very theoretical terms. But this is the idea. Let's approach complexity as hands-on practitioner, as problem solver, as thinkers. let's approach complexity for a completely different angle, that is practice. Indeed, if you want to introduce complexity to your teammates, to your team, to the rest of the organization, the best thing to do is to act your way into the new thinking. Instead, the majority of the people, when they approach a new idea, they learn about the new idea starting from example and hands-on practices. So this is an extremely effective way to introduce complexity into the team and the organization. Now I would like to talk about the second group of practices. We as a human being, we have cognitive biases, and we also tend not to see what we don't expect to see. So when there is some work to do, we are in the team and there is some work to do coming in. If we are someone that is used to deal with a lot of simple problems, will very likely tend to see all problems as a simple. And so we will judge the new work to do as simple. If instead we are someone that tend to deal with a lot of very complex problems, we will tend to see all problems are complex. And without knowing which is which, we will always adopt the same way of working, regardless of the type of work that is in front of us. So the idea of this new group of practices is to have a way to actually assess the real degree of complexity of the work in front of us so that we can adopt accordingly. Now in the organization, there are different complex systems, potentially complex systems. Starting from the right side is the one that I'm sure you know very well, technology. The network of components, code bases, software modules, services, servers, and infrastructure, all coming together and creating potentially complex dynamics. The second potentially complex system is people, the social relation between the employees, the consultants, the suppliers, the partners, as well as the users, tech-savvy and hyper-connected users. On the right side, we have the fuel that fuels the organization, and this is the work to do. The work to do that can also be complex because of the domain, the requirements, and the knowledge that is required to understand the work to do. So these fuels come in and may activate a dynamic in the people and the technology that can be more or less complex. You may wonder then, what makes it more complex or less complex? Well, in the requirement, for example, the rate of change of the requirements can create complexity. Some of the requirements can be competing to each other and in conflict, and then there is a lot of new information coming in. There is also the people side of it. People, our creativity can be unpredictable. We may have goals that are misaligned, or there be conflicting interest among stakeholders. And then the technology, the one that you know extremely well. We may have plenty of dependencies, a massive legacy code base, technical debt, fragile integration, and a rapidly evolving technological ecosystem, new technology continuously coming in. So here it is, another practice to estimate the degree of complexity. This practice is from Litz Keogh. Litz suggest that when a team has some work to do, they can use this scale to assess the degree of complexity. And this practice is based on this idea, on this question: who in the world has done this before? Now, I'm giving you a very short and quick summary of this practice just to give you an idea. The 4 and 5s in this scale means that nobody or almost nobody in the world has done this before. Instead, 1 and 2s means that we all know how to do it. Let's suggest that the 4 and 5s are very new and innovative type of work with a lot of uncertainty, unknowns, And so this is where our delivery initiative can be not feasible at all, or the estimates can largely depend on these items. But on the other side, these items can also be extremely innovative, and they can bring most of the return on investment. So she suggests start looking there, start working with those items. Then there are the ones and the two. It's very likely that those items has been commoditized. So you may look into the market and you may find standard component or standard services out there available in order to speed up the development. In this group of practices to assess the degree of complexity, you find these 4 practices, again, listed from the smaller and simpler to introduce to your team to the bigger. When I work with the team at the delivery as a team member or as a facilitator, I often use the first practice, sensing complexity. Is based on the work of Ralph Stacey, and is extremely fast. Then when I work on larger initiatives, so for example, when you have a chunk of work that is 3 or 6 months big, then I use complexity estimation. It's a little bigger practice in order to estimate together with the team all the 3 elements of complexity: technology, people, and work to do. The second group of practices is about adapting to the degree of complexity. So when you know how complex is the work, then there are many things that you can adapt in order to use the right approach for the complexity of the work that you are dealing with. You can adapt the estimates, you can adapt the decision-making approach, you can adapt the setting of the teams and your way of working, as well as the strategy that you use to deliver the initiative, but also the practice that you use to commit and invest in the delivery initiative. As a member of the team and as a facilitator of the delivery, I often use the last one, estimate accuracy with the cone of uncertainty. It is a practice that takes some loose inspiration from the cone of uncertainty and apply that to complexity, to different degree of complexity. Instead, when I work as a technical coach or as an agile coach, helping a team or an organization to adopt agile software development, I use practice number 7, C2 approach space, in order to assess how much agility the team and the organization may benefit from based on the average complexity of the work that they deal with. And here we are. This is the last group of the practices. These practices are based on 3 pillars of complexity. The first pillar is co-creation, the other is co-evolution, and the last one is emergence. In agile software development, instead of emergence, sometimes we say simplicity. Co-creation is a collaboration pattern that is extremely effective when we are dealing with the complexity. So it points back to the human element. What does it mean, co-creation? It means sharing our creative space with other people, think together, work at some artifact, gradually create and evolve that artifact in real time together. I know that before you talk about pair programming and ensemble programming. Those are 2 examples of co-creation. So in this group, there are a few practices that are based on these 3 dynamics. And in particular, co-creation. After looking at these practices, I realized that many other practices many other Agile practices could equally be part of this group. Why? Because also Agile is based on exactly the same three pillars: co-creation, co-evolution, and emergence. These three practices are those three, again, listed from the smaller to the bigger. The one that is usually more successful is culture affinity assessment. It's based on the Lalux culture and is mapped to a different level of Agile software development. So here we are back at the initial list of the catalog with all the practices. Listing the practices is quite powerful because after I listed the practices, I realized something important: the landscape of the practices inspired by complexity. So there are three regions. The first one is based on the idea that we are complex, individuals and teams. And here is where we talk about self-organization. The second region is founded on the idea that the work that we do may be complex. And this is where there are the practices that assess the degree of complexity and adapt to that degree. And the third one is about organization that may be complex. And this is where those practices allow us to reflect at all the organization and think about the organization and the way that the organization works in a completely different way, inspired by complexity. Here you see some of the practices that I mentioned mapped in this way. What is the use of the map? Why a map is important? Because a map can be a way for you to find something, but you can also use a map to explore a territory when you know how the landscape is shaped, and you can go and find something new, create a new practices. So this is why knowing a map is important. Here you see another map of the second group of practices, and this is the last map of the three group of practices. Here instead, you find all the concepts that are used in the catalog and in the related practices. We talk about many of those concepts. As I mentioned before, here you find the book. You can also find the blog where you can find the feed for more posting on complexity.